Good evening. This program, Historical Sketches, is shown in Portland, Oregon, and on various stations across the nation. But it is also accessible through the dailyshakespeare.com website and or, if you like, directly on YouTube. Historical sketches have a good international following, and I say this because the subject of this historical sketch, namely the life of John Browm, may give to our international viewers a glimpse and the general of the political conditions and of the general frame of mind in America during the turbulent years preceding the Civil War. Especially the divisions that led to the fracture between North and South, with the following bloody Civil War that caused about 650,000 deaths and an almost equal number of wounded and disabled soldiers, if not more. John Browm was executed in 1859 for having attempted to organize the blacks so that they could free themselves from slavery. And it is historically ironic that his execution preceded by 3 years Lincoln's limited decree of emancipation. Limited because the original emancipation only affected the slaves in the South. Now, historians have argued no end whether Lincoln was a true abolitionist or whether freeing the slaves in the South was a great strategic move to disrupt the logistic capabilities of the Confederate States in the South, thus reducing their fighting effectiveness. The fact that John Browm is now recognized as a historical hero of the Republic shows how judgment depends on the revolution of the times, as Shakespeare would say. John Brown's intuition, which cost him his life, was that the price of repression is greater than the cost of liberty, and that the degradation of men costs something to the degraded and to those who degrade. After the Renaissance, the Reformation, the French Revolutions, and the rights of men, the system of slavery was moving those who believed and wanted to maintain slavery. It was moving them backwards towards darker ages of force, of caste, and of cruelty. Making, we could say, with the wisdom of the after times, making a mockery of the very words of the Declaration of Independence. John Browm typified 3 essential and separate strains that could be identified in the independent United States. One of the strains was Puritanism, the last result of the Lutheran revolt. The second was new vigor and thrift of the Renaissance, imported from Holland and from England, countries that, together, imported the stricter principle of capitalism. The third strain came from France and Ireland, that is, a passionate desire for personal freedom. And these traits, we could say, were all represented and embodied in the character of John Browm. He was born in a religious environment in 1800 in Torrington, Connecticut, and when he was 5, the family moved to Hudson, Ohio, where Owen Browm, his father, operated a tannery. He grew up as a firm believer in the authenticity of the Bible, of which he committed long sections to memory. His first broad contact with the business of life came with the War of 1812, to which we dedicated 3 episodes among our historical sketches. And this was a war launched by the United States for the purpose of annexing Canada. And in the context of that war, John's father had become a beef contractor. John saw the effect of the war on the diseased and on the wounded passing through Hudson, returning from Detroit. The effect on him was such that he would neither train nor drill. However, John Browm learned and taught himself several trades: a land surveyor, which would come useful to him in his anti-slavery project, a tanner, a lumber dealer, a postmaster, a wood grower, a stock raiser, a shepherd, and a farmer. Brown's father married 3 times and had 16 children. John Browm himself married twice. His first wife died soon after delivering his 7th child, and his second wife gave him 13 children, 20 in total. His business activity even brought him to England, where he unsuccessfully hoped to sell high-quality wool and bypass the monopoly with which the textile manufacturers in America strangled the wool producers. Given the fact that John Browm is remembered in history as a hero in the fight against slavery, it is interesting, I think, and to trace the motives that turned a typical religious and law-abiding frontiersman at the time into a determined freedom fighter for the rights of slaves. You may agree that when a man develops a personal and life-changing worldview, there is a trigger point that prompts the rising of a new frame of mind and causes an important decision to be taken. It could be an episode, an unpredicted or unpredictable event, a consideration that suddenly clarifies his thoughts. In any event, in any case, that consideration, that personal illuminating insight changes the course of his life. Let's see then what turned a frontier merchant, a tanner, a shepherd, and a businessman into a fiery fighter for the freedom of the slaves. And here is the incident. But first, some brief historical clarification on the subject of slavery in America. As you know, way before the Civil War, some of the American states had abolished slavery, namely in the North, where slavery was, but in the South, was enforced in the South, the slavery. And this created a situation in which many slaves, in order to obtain freedom, escaped from the South towards the North through a system came to be known as the Underground Railway. It had nothing to do with a railway, but it was an irregular, if you like, swath of land, a geographical corridor that the slave followed to reach the North. In these various organizations of volunteers who were opposed to slavery. The situation was unacceptable to the southern states, and starting even back in the 18th century, several laws were passed to enable the capture of runaway slaves. These laws were difficult to enforce, as you can imagine, and were not easily acted upon in the slave-free states. There were also a few slave insurrections in the South, the most famous being the Nat Turner insurrection of 1831. Ohio was a free state and home to some already free African Americans and runaway slaves. And the Browm family had helped some runaway slaves from being recaptured, and where they all decidedly anti-slavery as a notion and as a practice. In 1837, the Browm family moved to Franklin, Ohio, and joined the local Congregational Church. Now, there were a number of free and fugitive colored persons in Franklin, Ohio, and they too became interested in joining the church. But when they entered the church, they were confined to a place at the end of the aisle from where it was essentially impossible to participate in the ceremonies and see what was going on. On noticing this, Browm Sr. first brought the attention of the audience to this discrimination, a matter which is obvious to us today, but then clearly a novelty, somebody who would stand for someone else. Then, on one of the next sessions, Browm Sr. invited the colored group to occupy the Browns' pew, while the Browns themselves moved to the bottom of the church, occupying a position that had been vacated by the blacks. The next day, a deacon visited the Browm family, attempting to explain the inappropriateness of his action in the church as regarded the blacks. But the Browns wouldn't give up. So sometime later, the family received a note from the church essentially banning them because of some new invented rule that did not make even reference to their attitude towards the blacks, who had been invited to occupy their pew. And John Browm said, "This was my first taste of the pro-slavery diabolism that had entrenched itself in the church." The other life-changing episode has to do with a slave-holding Southern minister by the name of Reverend Thompson, who had brought his slaves north and preached in a local church. He then attempted to take his slaves back south, but they were unwilling to go. The slave husband of a slave woman escaped, and Mr. Thompson said he should carry the woman and the children back to the South, whether he could get the man or the husband or not, whether he could get him or not. Somebody asked him if he would separate man and wife contrary to their mind. And the minister replied, "I married them myself and did not enjoy obedience on the woman." Which was an interesting piece of reasoning. The minister married the slaves, but his property rights over the slaves took precedent over the bond of marriage. It's a case of capitalism 1, religion 0. These events left an imprint in John Brown's mind, and he gradually acquired deep hatred of slavery. Eventually, he dedicated his life and actually gave it up for the cause. As mentioned, he undertook several business ventures, all of which in one way or another were affected by multiple economic crises, due to which he lost his investment in money and labor and had to start every time from scratch. In fact, when he died, he still had an unsolved debt, and he left in his will $50 to be remitted against that debt. The abolitionist movement developed in the north of the United States, and the first recognized leader among the African Americans was, of course, Frederick Douglass, who launched his paper, The North Star, advocating the abolition of slavery. John Brown met with Frederick Douglass, but they had different views on how to achieve the abolition of slavery. Douglass was for a soft approach, essentially converting and convincing slave owners to give up their slaves. John Brown, more realistically, thought that this was impossible. No political action could achieve it. Unfortunately, as you know, John Brown was right. John Brown was executed for trying, but 2 or 3 years later, about 650,000 Americans, as I said, had to die during the Civil War for that cause, which should be a universal warning that social changes against oppression and growing inequality cannot be achieved by peaceful means, such as marches, protests, etc. At least history tells us that much. John Brown's idea was to organize a revolution among slaves in the South, leading to their emancipation. Then, in 1850, a new fugitive law was passed by Congress, which meant that slaves that had escaped into free states could be legally pursued, arrested, and transported back to their owners. And this gave rise to an industry of the repossession of human beings, with all the possible related horrors you can imagine. And it was in this climate that John Brown founded what is called the League of the Gileadites, the first armed organization of Negroes. The name comes from the Bible. Mount Gilead was the place where only the bravest of the Israelites could gather together to face an invading enemy. However, the first armed action by John Brown took place in Kansas, where he led a small group of volunteers. And here we must give some background. Napoleon, in 1804, had sold a large swath of American land to the United States, what became known as the Louisiana Purchase. He sold it literally for a song, mainly because he was occupied in creating an empire in Europe, as you know. In 1820, the slave-holding settlers moved to Missouri. And in neighboring Texas, the settlers who had actually been invited by the Mexican government, dangerous step with the wisdom of the after times, the settlers had made what we call today an Orange Revolution and declared independence from Mexico. Mexico had abolished slavery, but by being independent, Texas became first a slave-independent republic, and after annexation to the United States, a slave state. 3 years later, in 1848, the U.S. declared war on Mexico, occupying actually Mexico City. The slave aristocracy now envisioned a slave empire stretching from Ohio to Cuba, Venezuela, and beyond, all through Central America. Meanwhile, the U.S. West was removed from Mexico and annexed. In the continental U.S. proper, a thorny issue came up with the annexation of Kansas, which gave rise to what came to be known as the Border War. To place this into context, In 1820, the Congress of the United States passed what came to be known as the Missouri Compromise, according to which all new states of the Union above the latitude of 36.30 degrees would be slaves-free, with an exception for the state of Missouri. According to this law, therefore, Kansas, and according to the Missouri Compromise, was to be slave-free. However, immediately another issue arose, which shows us that, unfortunately, treaties and conventions are in general but a truce, a temporary respite in the constant struggle for economic interests. In 1854, the Congress passed what was called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and this act was called for popular sovereignty, that is, the decision about slavery was to be made by the settlers of the states involved rather than by outsiders. It would be decided by votes, or more exactly, which side had more votes as counted by the officials. At the heart of the conflict was the question of whether Kansas would allow or outlaw slavery, and thus enter the Union as a slave state or a free state, as they were called. Pro-slavery forces maintained that every settler moving to Kansas had the right to bring his own property, including slaves, into the territory. And here another consideration is in order. As mentioned, a good number of slaves seeking freedom escaped from the south to the north via what I said before was called the Underground Railway. Some moved to Canada, but some remained in the free states. Their presence, however, was anything but welcome, and this was due partly to racism, but partly to the fact that cheap labor available from the free slaves caused a general reduction of the cost of labor, with increasing poverty among the current population, which explains, at least partially, why even in the North, the idea of abolishing slavery was not wholeheartedly welcome, especially by the poorer working people. Therefore, there were essentially three conflicting parties involved in the issue. The abolitionists, who did not want slavery and accepted the blacks, those who did not want slavery but did not want the blacks either, and of course the slave party that we've talked about. Back to Kansas now and to the election. Even today, as we know, there are questions as to whether elections are fair and whether the electoral votes are fairly counted. You can imagine the situation in 1850s without computers or anything else. Prior to the Kansas elections, masses of very unruly settlers of Missouri moved to Kansas in order to receive a majority for the pro-slavery voters. In the meantime, the abolitionist press in the North wrote about the beauty and fertility of Kansas, inviting settlers to move there in order to provide an abolitionist majority in the forthcoming elections. Enticed by this advertisement, several sons of John's Browm prolific brood decided to move to Kansas. Once in Kansas, John Brown's sons were immediately exposed to the harassment and animosity of the pro-slavery parties who arrived there from Missouri. John Brown's idea was to start a Negro revolution in the East over the Allegheny Mountains, but the news that he received from his sons in Kansas convinced him that the first attempt at a resistance against the advance of the pro-slavery party could be carried out in Kansas. And in fact, the Border War, as I said it was called, which went down in history as that, was a prelude in a smaller scale to the Civil War that followed in 1861. In May 1856, a bunch of pro-slavery activists attacked and ransacked the town of Lawrence in Kansas, which had been founded by anti-slavery settlers, and to help ensure that Kansas would become a free state. The event was the official beginning of a guerrilla warfare between pro- and anti-slavery settlers. In reaction to the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas, by pro-slavery forces, John Brown and a band of abolitionist settlers killed 5 settlers from the Potawatomi Creek in Franklin County, Kansas. This was one of several bloody episodes in Kansas preceding the American Civil War and went down in history as the Potawatomi massacre. Here is the related historical marker in this now very peaceful, fortunately, setting. Then in August of the same year, 1856, a company of over 300 Missourians under the command of Major General John Reed crossed into Kansas and headed towards Potawatomi, Kansas, intending to destroy the Free State settlement there and then march to Topeka and Lawrence, other Kansas places. On the morning of August 30, 1856, they shot and killed Brown's son Frederick and his neighbor David Garrison on the outside of Potawatomi. Browm, outnumbered 7-1, arranged his 38 men behind natural defenses along the road, and firing from cover, they managed to kill at least 20 of the Major General Reed men and wounded 40 more. Reed regrouped, ordered his men to dismount and charged into the woods. Brown's small group scattered and fled across what was called the Marais des Cygnes River, French name, or the swamp of the swans. One of Brown's men was killed during the retreat and 4 were captured. While Browm and his surviving men hid in the woods nearby, the Missourian plundered and burned this Potawatomi place. Despite being defeated, Brown's bravery and military shrewdness in the face of overwhelming odds brought to Browm national attention and made him a hero to many northern abolitionists who gave him the nickname of Potawatomi Brown. After this event, Browm left Kansas partly because he had not enough resources to fuel a proper resistance against the slave party in Kansas, and partly to dedicate himself to his original program of starting a rebellion among the slaves leading eventually to their emancipation. The story of the conventions and meetings Browm attended in the US and Canada in order to incite the abolitionists to action is long and contorted. His success was mixed. He was able to get some arms and some funds for his first action, which was to be the assault to the armory at Harper's Ferry at the junction of the Shenandoah and the Potomac rivers. The idea being of acquiring more arms with which he would arm a black rebellion by taking the armory. John Brown rented what came to be called the Kennedy farmhouse, which had a small cabin nearby, about 4 miles north of Harper's Ferry, and altogether there were 19 people. Waiting for the attacks, they did their best to conceal their presence from the neighbors to prevent suspicions. The house served as barracks, arsenal, supply depot, mess hall, debate club, and home. Once more unsuccessfully, Browm tried to convince Frederick Douglass to join in the venture. But Douglass saw Brown's plan as a suicide mission that would mobilize the whole country against the abolitionist movement. In history, there are often occasional coincidences that connect people and events, both geographically and historically, totally independent of each other. In the instance, the drill master for Brown's venture was an English mercenary called Hugh Forbes, who had served with Garibaldi in Italy during the wars that led to unified and independent Italy. On October 16, 1859, Browm left 4 of his men behind as a rear guard and led the rest into the Harper's Ferry area in Virginia, as I said. One party captured Colonel Lewis Washington, who was the grandnephew of George Washington of old, along with several other watchmen and hostages. Brown's men wanted to capture the weapons and escape before word reached Washington. The raid was going well for Brown's men, and then they cut the telegraph wire and seized the Baltimore and Ohio train that was passing by. But for some reason, Browm let the train continue, and the conductor alerted the authorities down the line. Browm had been sure that he would win the support of local slaves in joining the rebellion, but a massive uprising did not occur, partly because word had not been spread about the uprising, so the slaves nearby did not know about it. And although the white townspeople soon began to fight back against John Brown and his raiders, his men succeeded in capturing the armory that evening. Next day, the local militia, farmers, shopkeepers surrounded the armory and captured the bridge across the Potomac River. Any route to escape for the raiders was now cut off. During the day, 4 townspeople were killed, including the mayor. And realizing his escape was cut, Browm took 9 of his captives and moved into the smaller engine house, which would then come to be known as John Brown's fort in history. The raiders traded sporadic gunfire with surrounding forces. At one point, Browm sent out his son Watson with a white flag, but he was wounded. He was shot and killed. Another of John Brown's sons, Oliver, was also shot and killed. Eventually, the Marines arrived from Washington, led by Colonel Lee, who later made a name for himself in the ensuing Civil War. Browm was hit and wounded, and in 3 minutes, all the raiders still alive were captured. Browm was taken to the courthouse in nearby Charlestown for trial. He was found guilty of treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia and was hanged on December 2nd. History is never scant in ironies. Brown's execution was witnessed by the actor John Wilkes Booth, who would later assassinate President Abraham Lincoln in 1865, at the end of the Civil War. On the day of his execution, Browm made an important prophecy. He said, "I, John Browm, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, I vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." A prediction which proved right then, and is probably extant today, notwithstanding all claims to the contrary by those interested in preserving their power and privilege. Ironically, sometimes traitors in one era become heroes in the next, and John Brown's inspired one of the most famous songs in the American folk music. Thank you for watching. I am Jimmy Moglia for Historical Sketches. Until next time, good night.
John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on.